body. Oh yeah, move body. Make you ring alarm. Oh yeah, shake body. Them girls just they feel me now. Cause I get some money, then they feel me now. Back then they do me anyhow. I don't get some money, they wanna get down. They want hold me for ransom. Cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. They wanna know where I come from. I they run to from Lagos to London. All the blessings and love I they see just they make me they shout hallelujah. I say all the blessings and love I they see just they make me they shout hallelujah. They hold me for ransom. Cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. They want hold me for ransom. Cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. Oh yeah, shake body. Oh yeah, move body. Make you ring alarm. Oh yeah, shake body. Pede calema, sagacité, équilibré, farotema, décalé, décalé, cricana, 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 pam, pam. So mundo, calopere, calopere, calopere. All the blessings and love I they see just they make me they shout hallelujah. I say all the blessings and love I they see just they make me they shout hallelujah. They hold me for ransom cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. They won't hold me for ransom cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. Oh yeah, shake body. Oh yeah, move body. Make you ring alarm. Oh yeah, shake body. Designer wear now. I can take all the girls on the way now. I'm the man of the year now. And my music they blow everywhere now. All the way from Katy, the whole world now just to hear me. My haters just to hear me, and nobody fit double dare me. All the blessings and love I they see just to make me they shout hallelujah. I say all the blessings and love I they see just to make me they shout hallelujah. They hold me for ransom cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. They won't hold me for ransom cause I'm young and I'm rich and I'm handsome. Oh yeah, shake body. Oh yeah, move body. Make you ring alarm. Oh yeah, shake body. Coupe, décalema, décalema, cricana, cricana, parote, équilibré, 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 parote, oh yeah, shake body, oh yeah, move body, make you ring alarm, oh yeah, shake body.
My days when I'm not with you, babe. Your love keeps me warm. Unconditional prisoner, number one. Your love give me something I want. Your one give me something to feel. Your one give me something that's real. So true love. At the end of the day, this is true. True love. Deep in my soul. You're dangerous. How can I trust? Still I want more. True love. Hey, can I you be number one? Girl, I love the way you make the thing go round. Now me and you go there as the song go on. Now me and you go there till the sun come up. It's how she control me. She did tell me, baby, pussy, don't you fool me. Hot fuck every day, she did consume me. Say she want it every day, we make it movies. My baby with me. Every day with me. See, every day we day with me, they with me. My baby, they complete me. Say my baby know the juicy, rara. Say the loving when she give me, I know. Say if I do time, she no leave me, my love. Say not the loving when she give me, I know. Say not true love. My days when I'm not with you, babe. Your love keeps me warm. Unconditional prisoner, number one. Your love give me something I want. Your one give me something to feel. Your one give me something that's real, so true love. the end of the day, this is true love. Deep in my soul, you're dangerous. I cannot trust, still I want more. True love. Baby, bang, 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 whoa. Baby girl, I want make our soul to feel like one. Baby girl, I want make our love to feel like one. Hold on to me tonight for life. Baby, bang, 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 whoa. Baby girl, I want make our soul to feel like one. Baby girl, I want make our love to feel like one. Hold on to me tonight for life. Night days when I'm not with you, babe. Ooh, your love keeps me warm. Unconditional prisoner, number one. Your love give me something I want. You wanna give me something to feel. You wanna give me something that's real, so true. Hey, girl, number one. Me and the man fi do you no wrong. You wouldn't dare, so if I never you so you belong. Me never get a love so strong, boy. You love where you get that tongue there from. Shift the tongue, sit down on the thing well long. We love it when you whine and go down, go down. Beat it up like a Congo drum, boy. True love, man. Y'all wind up your body pan a top. Get the thing tough, your pum pum buff. Bust a wine turn round for your fuck. True love. At the end of the day, this is true love. Deep in my soul, you're dangerous. I cannot trust, still I want more. True love. Let me tell you about streets anywhere we go. Dogs them serious, dog them no nervous. Boy, let me tell you about man we cool like an Eskimo. No boy can't go wrong with. Hey, I know so the things hit me G. One phone call it take to make some boy wipe up her hurt and drop down flat. From you not stop my food, dog. Me no matter about you and me no care about that. Can't talk in my face. Say them run place, I run them run round that. Man a action back, some boy only full of tough chat. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Talk them a talk, no action if you back. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Chat them a chat, me no pay that, no mind hear that. Empty barrel a make nice dog, them a no nobody, them a no nobody. Yeah. Just step to the president, all of me dogs, them a be a mad smaddy. Have a one piece of metal and a post dog, you know mad man from nowhere. You must see the whole of your life, cause it not work if you step to me. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Talk them a talk, no action if you back. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Chat them a chat, me no pay that, no mind hear that. One phone call it take to make some boy wipe up her hurt and drop down flat. From you not stop my food, dog. Me no matter about you and me no care about that. Can't talk in my face. Say them run place, I run them run round that. Man a action back, some boy only full of tough chat. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Talk them a talk, no action if you back. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Chat them a chat, me no pay that, no mind hear that. Boy them, no fear the boy them. Jungle no fear them, the wild no fear them. Both more no fear them, out of you no fear them. We don't play them, boy. Enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so, enough of them stairs so. Yeah. You don't listen when you say enough of them stairs so, full of chat enough of them stairs so, long time them stairs so, long time enough of them stairs so, yeah. Tall man tell him, carry on, hurry on. The world turf roll out, no fear nothing, cause no for them stairs, so. For them stairs, so. Chatter bag chatter them stairs, so. Love chatter them stairs, so. But not fit talk them stairs, so. Chat them and chat them stairs, so. Waste man them stairs, so. All of a man them stairs, so. Walk in a gang them stairs, so. Me no like how them, me no respect them, me no rate them, you know, cause I know for them. I got a pretty lady with no like no stress. She got her own but she needs some love. She got her own but she needs some love. And she tell me say now only me they make her love. Tell me say now only me they cool her stress. She tell me say now only me she want. She tell me say now me they make her calm. She tell me say that me they keep her warm. Wine on my body baby wine that. She tell me say my love make her wine that. She tell me say my love make her climax. She tell me say now only me they make her move. They make her feel right now. Girl, your body calling me right now. Girl, so many things in my mind now. Make you suck, make her fuck, baby, right now. I've been waiting for tonight, where the energy feels right. When my touch make you feel right. Since tonight we come alive. Make a drink up while we reminisce. Say a prayer for our enemies. Say my love, now your remedy. Baby girl, you mean a lot to me. Got the pretty lady with no like no stress. She got her own but she needs some love. She got her own but she needs some love. And she tell me say now only me they make her love. Tell me say now only me they cool her stress. She tell me say now only me she want. She tell me say now me they make her calm. She tell me say that me they keep her warm. She tell me say now only me they make her feel alright. Yeah, she tell me say now only me they make her feel alright. After the baby me and my baby, yeah, we cuddle every night. She dey riding like a bike riding 1,000 miles. Steady when she riding and she gentle when she ride. These guys wine to make my one fight. This one you show me one day pass my eye. When the matter was baby, can you go down? I'll be waiting for tonight, yeah. She said we be the man, yeah. She said we get this stamina. I'm again want me now. Make a drink up while we reminisce. Say a prayer for our enemies. Say my love, now your remedy. Baby girl, you mean a lot to me. Got a pretty lady with no like no stress. She got her own but she needs some love. She got her own but she needs some love. And she tell me say now only me they make her love. Tell me say now only me they cool her stress. She tell me say now only me she want. She tell me say now me they make her calm. She tell me say that me they keep her warm. Show me one thing that got you tripping. Show me one thing they make you want some more. South London girl make me trip. South London girl they make my dead them balls. Go back to my Asian girl. I said I big up my Jamaican girl. I said I big up my African girl. I guess a lady from Miami know they make me red. Got a pretty lady with no like no stress. She got her own but she needs some love. She got her own but she needs some love. And she tell me say now only me they make her love. Tell me say now only me they cool her stress. She tell me say now only me she want. She tell me say now me they make her calm. She tell me say that me they keep her warm. Now I'm giving my testimony. I'm killing the beat and I'm giving them heat. So now I'm giving them everything. I'm living my life, I don't chop the money. I don't taste money. My guy, I'm allergic to poverty. So I'm using my sense to gather the property. Say, no time, no. Like a statue of liberty. Nobody knows tomorrow, so I'll be holding my destiny, yeah. As it be be saying I don't go. Some people they walk below. I continue the struggle they double my hustle. As if be saying I don't go. Some people they walk below. I continue the struggle they double my hustle. Now I'm giving my testimony. I'm killing the beat and I'm giving them heat. Now I'm giving them everything.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm here.
Welcome. I know it's the end of the weekend, so I know it's been a interesting weekend for me in lots of ways. And I'm feeling a little bit tired. So I'm glad that we publicly committed to 60 minutes so that we can get back to resting, before we start our week on Monday. So how are
Ab-
you feeling?
that sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. So we are going to get started. I shared on Twitter some infographics to support the conversation so we can keep it structured but still be flexible around what we're going to talk about. So, Dr. Opar, what I will first do is give what my inspiration is for being here, which basically is almost a daily inspiration to have this conversation, and then I will pass the mic to you.
Mhm.
I will say for me, one, as we had talked about in the Twitter thread, Black History Month is coming up, which is a very long month, even though it's the shortest month of the year. Most of us are invited to events and conversations and deal with the heightened level of anxiety that people have around this is a month that we have to focus on Black people. So I thought it would be helpful to have this conversation for that reason. But just in general, racial gaslighting is something that I find myself navigating on a pretty consistent basis in a number of different spaces. So we wanted to focus on the conversation because it's always going to be relevant, even if Black History Month is, not right around the corner. So that's where I'm coming from. Dr. Opara, what about you? What are you thinking?
Well, in doing this work, as I do anti-racist, anti-oppression, liberation work in various spaces, and specifically in the space of medicine and healthcare, public health. Uh, and as much as I do try to avoid necessarily be in a position of, and I know this is your position, Dr. Isom, but as you well know, I try to focus in Black liberation spaces mostly and not be in a position to be educating, quote unquote, white folk about what they need to have been known for a while now. But occasionally, especially in doing systems change work, I do interface with them. And then also even up to recently in terms of building accountability systems, you tend to have to report experiences and so that certain individuals or processes can be held accountable. And so I have been in the positions to be gaslit, so to speak, right? And those experiences, or when trying to sort of again help people to come to the place so that for them to appreciate the imports and the urgency therefore of a situation, needing to sort of help them to get to that place. So there have been various encounters of gaslighting in that regard. And of course, we'll get into details like in the conversation, but and I think it's really important. I think people encounter this in enough times where they get shut down, which again, due to things. One is sort of our own sort of mental health impacts on that, vis-a-vis trauma. And but then also it shuts down the work. So their work, especially if there are people that are about the work of, systems change, that work then gets stifled, it gets impaired. So for the purposes of those two reasons, I think it's important that we engage in this and present, some guidance here and some tools.
Thank you for that. Um, yeah, and I could say something, but I'm gonna resist. So
Don't resist, girl. This is that space. Go ahead, say it.
well, I mean, it's sort of like I know a part of what we're going to talk about is moments that stick, and moments stick typically when there's a strong emotional connection to a moment,
and it
Right.
becomes consolidated as a memory. And it's a memory that doesn't get discarded easily because there's just such a strong emotional, valence to it, or like atmosphere to it. So I can remember, if I was going to summarize the end of 2021 for me, 2021, I would say there was like a supreme example of gaslighting that I experienced, and
Mhm.
um, can reference here. But the more I reflect on it, the more I want to revisit the interaction and go back and just like scream from the rooftops, y'all are gaslighting me right now. Like, just like to verbalize it and to explain it as that thing, when it was happening. So I've just been reflecting as we've been preparing for this, on even for me, having an intellectual appreciation for it, but not always calling it out in the moment when it's happening, even when there's enough, psychological safety to do so. But we will get there. So I think the first part of the conversation can be just what is racial gaslighting, and
Exactly.
yeah, give a little bit of history, and then I'll have you read off the definition that we have here in the infographic. So I learned this from watching a video on YouTube by Black women, of course, that talked about racial gaslighting and about the history of the term being from a movie that was called Gaslight. And in this
Mhm.
movie, there was a couple living in a home, and the husband in that couple was turning off the lights, and these were gas lit lights, was turning off the lights over and over again. And then the person's wife would say, hey, the lights are flickering, but the husband would say, no, they're not. So the husband kept flickering the lights repeatedly over a length of time, to the point, and kept denying when the wife expressed, that this was happening, kept denying it was happening, so much so that the wife actually, for lack of a better, phrasing, began to feel not sane, began to feel crazy, and began to question the reality of her experiences. And that's where the term, what the term is rooted in. And gaslighting is typically talked about in conversations about narcissistic personality disorder, although in public discourse, everybody has narcissism apparently. So often what people are referencing are narcissistic traits. That's me throwing my psychiatrist perspective in there. So there's narcissistic personality disorder, which has very specific, symptoms, and you go through a diagnostic process of coming to that conclusion. And then there's the narcissism that we can recognize in ourselves and in others. And a really helpful way of thinking about this developmentally is that children are inherently, developmentally appropriately so, in a narcissistic space where everything is about them and their reality. And even if you present them with facts like, you hit me, they are crying as if you hit them. And then you have to, meet them where they are because it's developmentally appropriate. That is not the same as interacting with adults. And I'll pass it to you, Dr. Opar. What is this racial gaslighting thing?
I need to just leave it on mute because it always takes like a second to unmute. And then I was putting in the movie, Gaslight movie link into the YouTube and the Zoom chat. And it's a 1944 movie with Ingrid Bergman for those who like old movies or watch old movies. So would you like me to read this definition first or? Okay. So it is a form of psychological manipulation that makes those observing or being subject to racism question their own observations or experiences of racism. And so for me, what that you know, it's like, saying to a colleague, oh my goodness, that person just asked me if I was the housekeeper, you know. Well, maybe you look like one of the housekeepers they just saw,
Right.
you know. Um, uh, oh my goodness, this male fellow, told me I was insulting, true story, insulting them because I was asking to speak to his attendant in regards to the care of a patient we both share.
Mhm.
And this is one of the sort of second guessing of knowledge and qualifications, unfortunately, that I go through every day as a Black woman physician. And to the point that a trainee feels comfortable to literally tell me that I'm insulting them because I'm asking to speak with their attendant. And this is straight up violence, because I don't say microaggression. It is a straight up aggression and violence that is essentially misogynoir, and I need you as the, their boss to call them, hold them accountable. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it was inappropriate and unprofessional. I can't really say if it was because you were a woman or a Black woman. First of all, I'm not asking you to say or not say. I'm not getting your permission, our approval to define my own experience. Matter of fact, between you and I'm the expert of what it means to experience racism, sexism, and the intersectionality inside of that. I am telling you, this is what happened. Hold them accountable. I'm not here for your opinions. That is extremely unfounded. Based on what? Mm-hmm. I'm telling you, as an expert, a 40-year-old expert, having worked the earth for 40 years, the earth for 40 years as a Black, in this Black female body, right? And the last however many as a Black female body, adult body, that this is the experience. You don't have to understand or even agree, because none of that is relevant to the conversation. I've informed you. Please hold them accountable, as is in line with your role as their supervisor. And so, yes, it's that second guessing, that searching for alternate explanations for your experiences, that are you sure, prefix to their response or reaction to, again, what you shared. That will be one of the common forms of gaslighting. What say you?
I mean, I could say a whole lot. I mean, I'll say, just to tease some things out. One thing that you like you talked about was your expertise from your lived experience in the body that you possess. And, you also have other expertise as well, because we've developed racial literacy by doing some reading, right? So we've dived deep into how racism can manifest itself in a number of different ways, right? Deep, and the thing is no matter how deep we dive into any topic, including our ability to perceive, racism in the environment around us, to detect it, we are not trusted to accurately report our own experiences. And that is across the board, right? If we were having a conversation about racism in medicine and how patients present and talk about their concerns, including pain, there's always this skepticism. Do you really hurt that much? Or are you really sure that you're experiencing crushing pain in your chest that's a heart attack? Or are you just anxious, right? So we're constantly up against that questioning of our ability to accurately interpret reality. And that can be very disorienting, because you know who you are, know what you know, but in this moment, they're challenging you enough to push you to sometimes reconsider. So I'll say a few more phrases, and I want to lift up this Instagram post from Jacqueline Iyama, and I will paste that name into the YouTube. They have an infographic that went viral, I think a couple years ago, and they had listed some phrases that you might hear. So building on what Dr. Opara has offered, things like, if you protested or said it peacefully, more people would listen to you. Or what I said is not racist when confronted with that information. Or racism doesn't exist anymore, or why is it always about race, or are you sure that it's happened, etc. So I'm going to share the next infographic and turn down this phone that's heading my way. Just a second.
But while you're doing that, another common thing is when they start to define it for you. So they'll be like, well, racism is when one person doesn't like the other because of the color of their skin. And that's not the reason. That's not what's happening here. The over-intellectualizing of your experience, right? I'm like, wait a minute, what you're not going to do is shift the goalposts. Just go ahead and, say, well, if you're eating an orange and you're eating the orange, and you're like, hey, this is the orange I'm eating. And they're like, no, that's an apple. Well, listen, an apple is any fruit that is round. And so therefore, you are eating an apple. In other words, they sort of take they create a definition and then build the world according to their own definition. And so your experiences, if it doesn't line up with their definition, is therefore null and void. That is a complete power play, because it literally is the sort of like, I'm going to just go ahead and exert my power, right, as in this white body, usually white male body or white adjacent body, or even if it's a person who isn't white and or male, but certainly someone who is trying to approximate themselves to whiteness and oftentimes maleness as well, and that are sort of using a power to define literal words, and therefore, mark your experience within the context that they've created, so that they can control, you and your experience. So, yeah, that's another common way that it can show up.
Right. And it's hard. I mean, even the sturdiest person, and by sturdy, I mean like able to withstand, stress, or able to withstand challenge, can feel disoriented in response to being gaslit. And
Absolutely.
we wanted to share just a few ways of detecting that you were experiencing gaslighting, and they're here on the infographic. And some things that you might notice are that someone's like twisting the truth, or they're just really dismissively invalidating what you've offered as your experience, completely discounting it without exhibiting any kind of cultural curiosity or humility around maybe they don't have enough information to challenge what you've described as your experience. They might also twist the dynamics and say you're being aggressive when they are actually in the aggressor role. And, not to get too psychodynamic with the language, but we absorb things from other people consciously and unconsciously. So when you're in these moments feeling like the aggressor, the question to ask is, am I absorbing what's coming from outside of me, or is this me, right? And that takes a lot of thinking as well, because we'll often internalize their projections of how we feel, and then we identify with those projections. That's projective identification. And then we actually feel how they are unconsciously and sometimes consciously wanting us to feel. So very complicated, but we can all instinctually relate to those kind of interactions. And then, you'll be questioning your own judgment, your own perception, your own memory, and I'll be texting Dr. Opara or my network, my gaslighting network, to say, girl, this is what happened. Now let me tell you. And then I'll break it down, and we'll talk about why it's helpful to record what happened so that you can tell your gaslighting network. But I'll be asking, like, dude, this is what happened. Like, what do you think? And helping to kind of get myself back on track, because it does happen to the best of us, for lack of a better phrasing. We get thrown off track and we feel disoriented, and we need some support coming back to ourselves.
Absolutely. And another way is, I think you said that also, but as you said, the flipping. And so in this same case that I referenced earlier, and reporting the case to the supervisor, to one of the supervisors, again, to hold the individual and process accountable, he then flipped it around and said, wait a minute, maybe you're the one expressing or demonstrating bias because you think that this person treated you this way, because not necessarily because I'm a woman, but because they're a man. So maybe I'm expressing anti-male bias. I was born at night, honey, but I wasn't born last night. You are wrong, and let's not do this again. I mean, and so that's another common one. So to your point, Dr. Isom, not only is it like an absorption, but it could also be literally shoving it right back at you and say, well, maybe you're the racist. Maybe you're the person with bias. Maybe we have seen, Dr. Isom, a lot of people attend these anti-bias, implicit bias workshops, and then come out now with new terminology, just like the narcissism, right? Terminology, fling it around irresponsibly, right? Use it to sort of, lay it at your feet. When you're calling them out, they call you right out with that line where they just learned it. They just went to implicit bias class. So they got new words for your ass. And so you come with your complaints, they got their complaints right there with you. So, so that is another sort of form of gaslighting.
Yeah, and one of the things we'll show at the end, the last infographic, which includes some resources, and I pulled out 2 resources. One of them appears to be only useful to white anti-racists. It's the detour spotting for white anti-racists, but I use it as like intelligence. Is it co-intel? I don't know what it's called, but the point is, it's like I appreciate the labor of the individual who created this detour spotting for white anti-racist resource. And I'll put a link in the YouTube because it actually lays out the things that we are facing in these conversations or in these spaces. So I'm just going to say a few of them. And this resource is very detailed because it's intended for white anti-racists to have a increased awareness of how their racial socialization produces behaviors and ways of interacting that detour and throw us off track. And often it's rooted in lots of racial ignorance and also, other things, but we'll stick with racial ignorance, although that's a very generous, description. But so, for example, you might hear someone say, you're talking about race all the time. I don't see color. I'm colorblind. That can derail the conversation. Or they're offering some conversation about bootstraps. So, we're talking about some issue that clearly has structural components to it and history to it. And they say, something about merit, or it's a level playing field. If you just work hard, people will figure it out. Another one, Dr. Opara, you just talked about are these accusations of reverse racism. So why are you talking about Black pride or Black power? That's a little bit racist. Or why can't white people come to this meeting? That sounds like reverse racism. And again, these can kind of take people off track in the conversation. And a couple more. The blame the victim is one that we have to deal with as well. Like there's just something, if we're describing something that happened to us, well, what did you do to elicit that reaction? Or what did you not do to protect yourself from that reaction? And then the last one that I'll offer is this idea of like, you're sharing something and they are turning it to themselves. They're centering themselves. So, you might be talking to your colleague about them, offering what they offered, and they'll say, well, the anti-male bias thing. I've noticed that you're much harder on men than you are on others. I want to talk about your anti-male bias in this conversation. So flipping the script and kind of leaving you off kilter. So this resource offers some strategies for the perpetrators to avoid engaging those behaviors, but I found it useful to help me have some kind of like anchors or concrete handles in these interactions to know, okay, well, that's that thing that's happening right now. I've named that, and maybe sometimes that can help me crawl out of the abyss of being gaslit, which again, often includes feeling really confused and disoriented. What do you think about those examples, Dr. Opara, and then the idea that having that kind of information could be helpful to us moving forward?
Oh, absolutely. As I've always said, the ability to name what's happening is, like, in my opinion, 50% of the battle. And so that's, you always talk about racial literacy and improving and increasing our racial literacy, and our racial vocabulary is very important. So once we recognize what's happening, because one of the dangerous things about gaslighting is that, it makes you feel that something is wrong with you. So you second guess yourself for everything, and it affects all aspects of your life. So even your ability to make just judgment calls or decisions around your personal life, so in your relationships, at work, with your finances, and the list goes on, about your health, and the list goes on. So it's a very, very dangerous, and that's something we haven't really talked about, but that impact is not a just sort of run of the mill, nothing. It's really, really important, this issue. So being able to name it, recognize it, name it, and then begin to build your tools to mitigate the impact, prevent it, or straight up just eliminate it, stop it in its tracks, is really critical. But you got to start with the recognition and the naming of it.
Right. It actually reminds me of something that happened during residency, and we'll talk about options for what you can do internally within yourself and also externally as you interact with those around you. This is a time where I actually disengaged in response to gaslighting that was collective gaslighting. So I was a chief resident in my program, and specifically of medical education. So I was on this floor at a Veteran Affairs Center. And for people that don't know, VAs, you know, they might not even do DEI training, right? They're government funded, government run. A lot of the restrictions that you saw under the Trump presidency impacted what they could and could not talk about as it relates to DEI. Not only that, but within those systems, people are, you know, and I'm making a generalization, but in my experience, a little bit further behind on the train of like, let's think about what it takes to be inclusive and create a sense of belonging. But not only that, let's do what it takes to address racial injustice. So that's the context. So it was me with my Black woman afro, we got mixed up with each other all the time, wearing co-chief resident on this floor, doing our thing, who we are, which means that we talk about race and racism and whiteness. And I actually wrote a paper and submitted this vignette to JAMA and I think the New England Journal of Medicine in a discussion about white fragility. They rejected it. I'll keep trying. But what happened is that there was this moment where I was making a decision as the chief resident on the floor about a patient, and this nurse explodes, not exaggerating, explodes and says, "We know you think we're racist," right? Just leverages this accusation in a room full of other nurses. And it started a cascade of reactions. And what the floor collectively decided to do was not to have a conversation about institutional racism or other manifestations, but to prove that they're not racist. So the unit director, like who's in charge of the nursing staff, did her research and comes to this meeting a few weeks later and presents the data. The data that contradicts my assertion and that of my co-chief resident that racism is something that we should be talking about on the floor. So she detailed the staff, the demographic makeup of the staff, and all of these other things, and essentially laid it at my feet, suggesting that I was just this aggressive, loud person leveraging accusations at these really good white people. And there was no savior for me. There was also a lot of power dynamics there. So these were attendings, and this was like the other people who were in very high positions who were participating in this. So I disengaged. I checked out. That was in January or February. I checked out all the way until July, and I could not come back. I could not. It did not work out for me. So as we go into the conversation, I want to be transparent about, for me, sometimes I decide to disengage to protect myself, to lick my wounds and keep it moving. And not always is it, well, I'm going to just take on the entire, inpatient floor and prove to you all that racism is happening here. No, ma'am. But I will always remember that, because that was like a collective gaslighting versus just like individual. So what
Well,
do you
at first,
think?
yeah, no, first of all, I'm really sorry that you had to experience that. I mean, I just experienced secondary trauma just listening to that, because I can, I was also a chief resident. I understand that whole situation right there. Although you are in psychiatry and I'm internal medicine pediatrics, but I get it. And you're still a trainee, even though you're done with residency, but you're still a trainee. And I think the other piece there that really sort of hurt my heart to hear is that you did not have backup from your, sounds like, program director and from other faculty. And that's just wrong and miserable. So yeah, my heart definitely goes out to you for that experience. But two thoughts. One is that story perfectly illustrates the point I was making earlier, right? How the impact of gaslighting, this is not even though, yes, the term was gotten from a movie, but this is not Hollywood, right? This is real life. I mean, a whole physician checked out of her work for how many months? It sounds like 6 months, almost 5, 6 months, half a year. What was that impact on you? And then the people associated with you, related to you, your patients, your colleagues, your residents that are training up under you, and all of that, all and the work. How did it is a compounding effect on the negative and destructive impact. So this is not a trivial issue that we're discussing. It truly is just another, again, tentacle of white supremacy and the way it shows up in medicine and certainly other parts of healthcare and public health. The other piece of it is, again, this is why Ibram X. Kendi, this is why, who did he get it from again? Dr. Angela Davis said, it is not enough to not be a racist, right? You have to be anti-racist. And in the whole time we we're telling the story, in my head, I was just thinking like, and I wish I was there. I'll let them do all the research that they did. That's great. Thank you very much. Let them present it, feel them themselves, and then be like, please, what's the data to show the anti-racist work that you're doing? Because this conversation is not about whether or not you're racist. This conversation is about whether you are anti-racist. Because one of the things that folks love to do, like I said, is a power play to set the definitions. And so what I try to do, and it's not, by mistake, that a lot of folks that do Jedi education or anti-racist education like to level set with definitions. Because you are, once you set the definitions, you set the parameters of the conversation. It is also somewhat of a power play. When you're talking like this, it don't have nothing to do with this definition. You remember the first slide where we defined structural racism? What you're talking about, ma'am, ain't it? In what way does it? It's not aligned, then honey, we're not talking about structural racism. You're talking about something else. So let's get back to what we're talking about. And so I think, like, again, this is not saying this is what you should have done. This is just me reflecting right now in this moment. For anyone who may have experienced or something like it or related to that experience, my encouragement is set the parameters of that conversation. This power plays them getting to define what is. And I think one gift that Dr. Angela Davis, Ibrahim Kendi, and all the folks, our Black scholars have offered us is, again, it goes always back to what you say, Dr. Isa, about that racial literacy and understanding the ways the power dynamics and how they work, and refuse to sort of be pulled into that, and you set the dynamics of the conversation and you say, well, this is about being anti-racist. This is not about whether you're not being racist or not, because our knowledge and understanding of healthcare, medicine, and public health as part of America is that it's all racist. Period. This is the definition. And so what we need to be talking about is in what ways you're being anti-racist to save lives. And bring them to order. And I know we'll go into details there, but yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, it's just, oh God. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can relate to any person who says, you know what, like I just didn't have it, right? Or I couldn't even think. I was so emotionally impacted by what happened. I could not even think. And I talk a whole lot, but I was hurt. I was wounded by this because these were people gaslighting me who had met my baby. Like, I had a baby during residency, and this was the unit that knew her, right? Knew me, knew personal things about me. Some of them I'd known for, 4 years. So I was wounded by that interpersonal aspect of it as well. And repairing those relationships, I really could not. So that was a loss and also a disappointment. But the last thing I'll say about this before we transition to internally some things that you can think about is that one other way of describing this is as an institutional betrayal. Like institutional racism is a form of institutional betrayal. You are not doing what you are supposed to do to take care of me as a person here who's working for almost free, right, during residency. But you're not responding to my needs, right? And that communicates lots of things, right, about how much you value me and respect me. But it's harmful, and our well-being is sacrificed when we're in those kinds of contexts. So that's another term that might help people, help explain to themselves, what exactly is going on here. Institutional betrayal.
Yeah, and if I may, before we get into it, Dr. Isam, it's a loss of trust. And I think you may have mentioned this, but that is really key, right? And so as institutions and organizations and departments, divisions are trying to organize themselves and encourage people, yeah, tell me what's going on. I need to know what's going on in the department so I can better support you. Well, folks ain't gonna tell you anything if you're straight up gaslighting them and telling them basically they're not to be believed, they're not to be heard, right? Like you're not building, betrayal. That is the loss of trust and therefore loss of feeling of safety. You don't feel safe, right? And when you don't feel safe, you don't perform your best. You don't, and of course you suffer the consequences on your health, mental, physical, and otherwise. So that trust is really key, inside of that conversation, and how it becomes lost and compromised when there's gaslighting going on.
Right. Oof, man, there's so much there. I mean, if institutions as a form of accountability would acknowledge that they've betrayed the people that inhabit those institutions, that would be such a big step towards repair. But that betrayal is often disavowed, not acknowledged. And you bring it dismissed, which is another form of gaslighting. But all right, so what can we do in response to gaslighting? Here is a suggestion about internally what we can do. This is within ourselves. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on these, Dr. Opara. So one suggestion is that we mindfully recognize it in the moment or after the fact. Mindfully means recognizing what's happening, and there's sort of a little bit of a disconnect between you and what's happening, a little bit of space there that allows you to examine it, to make use of it, while also experiencing it at the same time. And that distance can be really helpful for processing. Another suggestion is to record your experience to help the processing. So write down what happened while it's fresh. That way, when you're texting or emailing or calling your network, you have those details available to kind of give you some anchoring. Another suggestion is to affirm your own feelings and opinions, telling this to yourself, like what happened to me, how I feel is real and valid, and I trust my own perception of reality. And sometimes just hearing yourself saying that out loud can be really helpful. And then obviously seeking out community. So who can you trust, whether it be an individual or a group, to actually offer you some recentering and offer like authentic support to you. And then of course, there's informal resources and communities, and also formal, like coming to see, a mental health professional or just someone that you trust to have those conversations, that can have a conversation specifically about racial stress and racial trauma, not someone who's racially ignorant or a group that's racially ignorant. So what do you think, Dr. Opar? Do any of these ring true for you? Have you done these things before? What's your reaction?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. I really love the affirm your own feelings and opinions. It is so important. And I love what you said. Can you say that again? I think the people need to hear those three things to affirm one's own feelings and opinions.
I forgot already, y'all. I talking. I don't remember what I said, but I think I said, I trust my own feelings. I trust what happened, and my feelings are valid, and I trust that my perception of reality is accurate.
That's right. And what happened to me. So what happened to me. I trust my own feelings, and my feelings are valid. And you need to say that and say to yourself. So I completely agree with that. And I have done that actually myself. And so when this experience that I mentioned earlier with a male, person who was a junior, sort of, was unprofessional and disrespectful to me. And I had to take a moment to say, hey, well, what's happening? Is this okay? This is not okay. And I have grown over time to realize and recognize that my perception of reality is true to me. Like it is valid and it's true. It's happening to me, and this is my perception, and it's valid. It took time, and it will also be related to your childhood, right? The way you grew up, sort of, were you someone who was believed, like someone who you've been taught that your word, is to be believed and is true? Are you someone who grew up understanding what boundaries are and your boundaries weren't violated, things like that? Dr. Isom is a psychiatrist, so she can go into that a little bit in depth, but why certain people may not trust their own feelings and opinions and experiences is really, really important. And so when it happened, I was able to receive it as such because I internally named it, right? I was mindful at that moment and was like, this is happening. I'm clear that, this is why it's happening. And I checked the behavior, absolutely called them out on the behavior. And I knew that accountability was key, because this person would do it to somebody else. And this person will also be problematic in the training. So I had to make sure that there was accountability. And so I recorded it, through email and expressing that also so as a paper trail to the supervisor. And I was clear about my feelings. And the other thing I also did was I named my feelings to them. I wasn't afraid of that. Look, I push and reject highly, and just I like that. That's one of the gaslighting statements you made, Dr. Isom. This taught that, well, don't be emotional. If you're emotional, they won't believe you. Are you kidding me? The emotion, the passion, the personality, that's what gets the heart. We're primarily emotional beings. Men are as emotional as women. Our expression may vary based on social conditioning, but we are not, it is sexist to label emotion when expressed through a female body as one thing and differently when it's a male body. It has nothing to do with the value of emotion or expressing emotion, but everything to do with society's value of the bodies that are expressing that emotion. So I am not ashamed or afraid or embarrassed to say what happened hurt me in this way. I'm not expecting them to do anything about it. I'm not expecting them to to cuddle or anything, but let it be recorded. I believe very powerfully in the power of documentation and recording. Let all witnesses know that this happened. I'm very, very, it is important because I am important. I matter. I'm of value. And what happens to me matters, not just for my sake, but also for the people I represent, people that look like me, people that have my heritage or my story, and it's worth it, So it's important that it's recorded. So it doesn't matter if how they react, that's their problem. But I affirm my humanity, naming how I feel about something. And again, because it's valuable. Before I do that externally, all of that has to happen internally. And like I said, I record it, make a paper trail through email, electronically, and then of course take care of myself. And I'm very, very blessed that I have a few siblings, sisters and brothers, mostly sisters, in medicine, in my institution, and of course beyond, people like Dr. Isom and so many others that I call when these things happen, who get it and are affirmative. And fortunately, my sister, colleague, is also the vice chair of JEDI in our institution. So this is something that she took on and is part of sort of her programming that she's trying to get done in the department. So she was able to translate. So it's a 2-for-1, because not only was she there to support me, but she was also able to translate that into programmatic change for the benefit of the entire department at this point. So yeah, rings very, very true.
It's a beautiful thing. I mean, two things that stood out. One, the question of, how your history informs how you respond, how you experience and also respond to the gaslighting. And then two, we've talked about this before, how us being transparent about our emotional experience is a way of confronting the tendency to dehumanize us, to strip us of emotions, or to constrain the kinds of emotions that we can experience. So Dr. Opara can be angry, but can Dr. Opara be hurt, right? Can Dr. Opara be wounded? Can Dr. Opara be traumatized? There's just some emotions or experiences that we don't have access to. So that naming is an intervention on that dehumanization that happens quite naturally because of how we're all socialized. So I love that piece. The other thing too is there's a lot of information out there about mindful self-compassion. So I want to add the self-compassion piece because that's I mean, I had to have that for myself in these experiences that, I can only do what I can do. There might be things that I wish I could have done differently, but I did the best that I could do during that period of time. Right. And my suffering is real, and how I navigate those situations is not just about the person I'm speaking with or the context I'm in, but about what's happened to me previously. So maybe, getting into hearing people yelling, I can't stand that. Partially true. This I was gonna say trick, yelling at me, that triggered it like a cascade of that heifer that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with my past. Like, I could not believe that she yelled at me. Who yells at people in a place of business? First of all, who's unprofessional at this time? And can we have a conversation about that? But we have to recognize that there's just some things that our history makes it difficult for us to do. And sometimes people have been so traumatized that they can only process. They can only process. That's the focus. That's their focus that is actually rooted in a survival. It's a survival focused. So I have to take care of myself and my wounds, and I can't necessarily be saving the world every time gaslighting happens. So that might be a way of helping us to understand why sometimes people might freeze in these interactions or fawn, where they kind of have this surface level, like appeasing of the person who's doing the gaslighting.
Mhm.
And they're like, did you not just like, are we on
Mhm.
the same team here? Are we on the same page? So
Mhm.
I try to understand other people's reactions, you know, also when they're different from mine. And I try to
Mhm.
remember that sometimes people just have been through too much, so much has been done to
Right.
that I can't have the expectation that they're going to be save a Jessica today.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
also always save myself, and sometimes I can only escape, you know.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pull out those two things from what you shared.
And I think it's so important. I think we've said this on this in this space before, and it's my ongoing lesson to learn. Yes, I know I come across like General Okoye of the Dora Milaje, ready to fight. And yes, you're not wrong. But again, where does that come from, right? Like, where does that come from? And we have to understand that, yeah, for every, if, speaking of that same metaphor, General Koye, there was Nakia, who was more of like a strategic person, and how do she was a spy and sort of more navigating a little bit more fluidly, whereas General Koye was just her spear, and she was just like knocking witches down. And so but it takes all of it. I think I've learned I need to practice that self-compassion. I think I'm glad that you said that. I learned about self-compassion inside of learning more about self-care, because self-care is a new concept for me. I had no idea what self-care. I was like, what is that? This American idea of self-care, just self-care again. And then come to find out more about it. But then in learning about it, understanding that critical to self-care is self-compassion. And of course, you got community care as a whole thing. But that self-compassion is very important, because when we are compassionate with ourselves, it's easy. We're allowed, it's a portal to compassion for others. But you cannot, like we say, pour from an empty cup. We have to learn that compassion for self, and understand that we're indeed valued and worthy and deserving of love and of kindness, and of being treated, well, which is why we should rightfully be shocked when we get, again, we're gaslit, and to be able to say, no, 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 no. I'm a person of intelligence. I'm a person of integrity, and I can recognize wrong when it happens. And so, no, this is, again, like, it's happening to me, and my feelings are valid and are real. And I can sit with them. So I think that that is a very important a piece to lift up inside of this conversation, the self-compassion piece. I can't say that enough. And the ability to understand that everybody's trauma response is different. And so I'm getting better. I hope I'm getting better at honoring all our different responses. And and just sitting with that, live and let live. And there are different times and places that call for different responses. And even I do occasionally fawn and freeze. Absolutely. I don't know if I mentioned here in this space or where it was, but maybe I did. My same sister colleague and I found ourselves in the physician's lounge. Jessica, you tell me if I've told the story. In the physician's lounge to get some a sandwich, and a male colleague behind us asked us if we were physicians in the physician's lounge that require your physician badge to get into, while wearing our scrubs, white coats, badge, stethoscope, scrub hats, everything, asking us, basically, do we belong here? Like, what are you doing here? You patients, or I don't know, housekeepers, nurses. I don't know what this idiot was thinking. And so at the end of the day, and I remember my response in that moment was to just stare at him, because I was like, what is happening? What is happening at us right now? And my friend's reaction was to, she just was like, of course we are. And then she showed her badge. And it was a whole thing. And because both of us were reacting out of trauma, but of course we shouldn't have justified. I mean, thinking about it later. Of course, we shouldn't have even given him the time of day. Should have just ignored the hell out of him. He could keep talking to the back of our head. And when we're done with taking all the food, then left, plus more, just fed the entire clinic from stash of unnecessary like food, and just walked out right after in the aftermath. But none of us are expecting these behaviors. We're just going in the world, minding our business. And that's why that statement, Dr. Ison, that you said is important. This thing is happening to me. It's happening at me because I am just being Black and like magical, minding my business, just getting a sandwich. And it happens. You're just out pumping gas, and it happens. You're writing an email, and it's just like you're just living life, Black wild, just like living. And so no one is to be faulted for like freezing, because did you plan this in your day? You did not. And even though many of us do put on an invisible suit, and we, stand up a little taller and put our chest out and our butts out a little just firmer to gird up against, a misogynistic world, no, you're still never prepared. So whatever your survival instinct or your survival response in the moment, in my opinion, is valid. And sometimes we beat ourselves up later. Man, I should have said this. I should have said that. Honey, did you survive the moment? Are you here now?
Right.
Then your response was right. And now with you putting like the tools that we just discussed in place, we can figure out if there is anything to be done after. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But you are here in this moment. You survived the moment, and like I'm talking to you, honey, then your reaction was appropriate. And every time, sort of just through your life, and you get more skills and tools and all that, practice makes progress. You get a little better. The first time these things happen, you might just be like a deer in the headlights. But unfortunately, the whatever number of time it happens, you might then, to the quickness or not. Either way, you survive the moment, you're still awesome and great, and you're fine. So yeah, this is, I think, a very important point that you mentioned.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to, because people corrupt language. So I encourage anyone who's watching, go look at the first descriptions of microaggressions from Dr. Chester Pierce, because he uses language that communicates the violence. One term I recall from his original descriptions was bombardment, that there's a constant bombardment, and he was specifically talking about Black people in white spaces, for anyone who's confused. But he talked about the bombardment that happens as we're just living our lives in all of these different ways. And what do you do when something hits you, right? You can do a few different things. You can hit back. You could look at where you were hit and decide what you're going to do and maybe just freeze. You could pretend that you didn't get hit because you're afraid of what the consequences might be. But the original language speaks to the violence of these interactions, how they land on us. And, for people who are like, I'm not checking for that microaggression term, I also would rather say like racial abuse, because racial abuse captures, again, the impact of these behaviors, these statements on us, how they land on our minds and also our bodies. But, Chester Pierce was a real one. And if you look at the original language, you'll see that was communicated in the descriptions. Shout out
thank you. Shout out to Dr. Chester Pierce, and shout out to history, and shout out to documentation and recording, so people don't, bastardize your language. And thank you for that. I feel schooled, because I'm one of the people who don't check for microaggression. But I feel like, okay, girl, you need to go read the original text. And remember, there is always an original text. And child, that's the problem of living in this society is, you say what you say, and then somebody comes, takes it, and say, but we want to make it more palatable. And it just turns into something else. So shout out.
Yeah, and I think at this point it's been corrupted so much that racial abuse is a way of recapturing those elements. Like I'm a fan of that. But as I tend to this noise, Dr. Opara, do you want to read off some external options for responding?
I do, and I also have noise too, so don't even worry about that. We both are Black working mamas, and the babies are gonna do what the babies are gonna do. Babies are gonna baby. And so how can we respond to racial gaslighting, which is a form, speaking of microaggressions and racial abuse or racial violence? Again, to me, I feel like this is all on the spectrum of violence. But how can we respond to this element of violence known as racial gaslighting? Well, externally, we talked about the internal piece. Externally, we can disengage if the risks outweigh the benefits. Okay, like Dr. Isom's story. If you judge and you look at the whole picture and the risks, not saying that there will be no risk, there will be risks, but if the benefits outweigh the risk, sure, you can go ahead and engage. However, if they outweigh the benefits, don't. Point out the behavior, right? Name it. Oh, I'm such a fan of naming. There is a caveat to that. I would love Dr. Isom's reaction to the caveat, which is when you call something out, and you know how folks don't like to be called what they are. So this behavior is racist, sir. I'm not a racist. And so what you do with sort of a like overreaction, or not overreaction, a hyper reaction to be when people are getting called out. So I think that is also, that in and of itself is a whole sort of, another talk. And list others present, right? I would say absolutely, and list others present. I'll be curious to know, Dr. Isom, what you think about how you do that. I feel like bystanders, and part of being a bystander is to stand up, right? Like emphasis on the stand of bystanders, and that hopefully a person who is the victim and or survivor of racial violence inside of this gaslighting point in the spectrum shouldn't also have to think about getting others. Now, if you're able to, sure, but I hope that bystanders and co-conspirators could go ahead and stand up in that moment, confront the distortion of your state experience, absolutely, name it. And I'll give you an example in a second of how your state experience is being distorted. Okay, and propose why. I'm a fan of that. As a guest, I wonder if maybe this is why, and use re-railing tactics to refocus the conversation on the racism. Hallelujah. And so one of the supervisors that I reported the incident to emailed me back and was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." No, he didn't say I'm so sorry. He's like, "Oh, absolutely, this is not okay. This person shouldn't have done." Should have just given you the name of the attendant, something like that. It's not okay to withhold the name of the attendant. And I said, well, thank you. You're absolutely right. You shouldn't have withheld the name of the attendant, but that's not the issue. All right. That's not the issue. And then I restated the issue again. And one thing I would just say inside of that, I would encourage folks is when you're doing the confrontation, when you are sort of pointing out the behavior or confronting distortion, when you are engaging and sort of self-advocating on these gaslighting issues, it is important. And this is also for me to be very clear. A simple language and straight and direct. Don't go round and round and round. Don't, just go straight in and name it and own it. Sometimes your conviction and confidence shuts people down. I know that happens with me. Oftentimes it shuts people down. When you are convicted and you're confident, it shuts people down. The people that, as they're getting ready they're like, yeah, maybe not. She right. And so, so you use simple language, be very clear so that it's not lost in the story. Because remember, this is a situation people don't want to engage. They don't want to deal with all this right here. So make it difficult for them not to deal with it, or rather make it easier for them. I would say make it difficult. You're not here to make anybody's life easy, Joe, but make it difficult for them to not engage, right? And by just keeping it simple, use direct language and just be like brief and just name it, boom, boom, boom. I struggle with that. I'm saying that as someone who is, a storyteller and verbose, and it's just always a constant, just, self-work. But I find that when I am like that bullet point, it helps. The stories help too, because those details are important when it comes down to it. And sometimes those details in the story really is the difference between like a decision. However, when you want to get that attention, at least hook them in, just really being like, this is what happened, this is why it's wrong, and this is what I'm seeking. This is the outcome that I'm interested in. It really helps. Dr. Isom.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, and I love that because, and I'll also say that what's underneath that is courage, and not always like completely, feeling comfortable in that moment. Because I know for me, when I'm confronting, the isms, I'm often terrified on the inside. I have a very physical reaction in these situations, but a part of what keeps me going is the mindful acknowledgement, that this is how I am feeling in this moment, but that's not going to stop the show, right? And we've already said that that's not something that we can do all the time, that there will be moments where we can only pay attention to our internal experience. But when you can have a mindful approach and decide, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to lay it out, it can be really effective. And people are really
Right.
good at what they do. They are really good at what they do. And I'm not saying people are good because they studied it necessarily, but they've been socialized into a way of shutting down your assertion of your experience. It just rolls off the tongue. The
Mhm.
invalidation, the dismissal, the debate. Well, let's deconstruct how racism was operating, but don't even know the definition of race or racism. But there's that,
Mhm.
and that's really hard.
Mhm.
So one of the other things I wanted to highlight is that, again, I appreciate, consuming how other people are approaching the issue. So one of the things I came across was this resource on re-railing race conversations, or re-railing conversations on race. And I did drop the link in the YouTube. And this offers, I think there's like, let me see what the count is. There are 17 interventions that can help you re-rail. So basically, we talked earlier about detours. People try to take it away from what the focus is, right? And you want to have a laser focus, and that requires you to do course correction, as Dr. Opara has outlined. And I do want to hold up the last suggestion on this list, which is sometimes you just got to say what you feel, and it's expletives, right? So sometimes you just have to say how you feel, and it may not be the prettiest thing to say, but it offers a number of other
Mhm.
options, including, for example, sometimes the other person just wants to get their statement in and their perspective in, and they're going to take the space anyway, but you being generous and letting them take that space, waiting until they finish, allows you to re-rail by saying, thank you for bringing that up, I appreciate your perspective, now let's get back to what I started the conversation for, which was to talk about the racism that happened to me or to that person or to those people over there, right? So there's the resource offers ways of managing the behaviors in the moment that run the gamut from cutting people off maybe and saying, you know what, look, you're bringing up something else that has nothing to do with this topic. Let's put that on the agenda for the meeting next week. But this particular conversation will be focused on what I already offered, because that's a respectful thing to do. That's how it works. We learned that in kindergarten, that you take your turn, right? So there are ways of doing it. So I encourage everyone, again, to use the resource to figure out what feels right for you, because there might be certain strategies that just fit your personality and your history. And then as far as this idea of like enlisting others, I will say that um, it's some enlisting others can be a little bit complicated. So I definitely rely on, I don't know what I would call it. Like there's just like if I'm in the space, I kind of know and can like communicate through, like, I don't know, the spirit world, that there's a moment where I can no longer do this and I need help. And if someone is similarly minded and similarly attentive, they can detect that and intervene. So there might be instances where I don't have to say anything at all and someone will step in. But then there are lots of situations where you have to spell it out for people. So I'll say it might be that you're in a Zoom or you, for some reason, have access to someone's contact information. I've texted or I've private messaged someone to step in and reinforce something that I've said. So enlisted people in that way. Or I might reference something else that someone said and like throw their name in there, and it could be a white person or even a white man, and use that to reinforce what I offered. So I might build off someone else's point and like wrap that into the point that I'm trying to make. But it is really hard if you don't know anyone in that space, you don't have ways of contacting them, they're not being attentive to you in that space enough to notice that you're suffering in that moment or that you need reinforcement. And then oftentimes you're kind of stuck stuck. And then at that point, you could decide to be transparent and say, you know what, I offered something here. I said something. I requested and in good faith expected that we would have a conversation about what happened to me or what's happening to me. And I've noticed that no one has stepped in to have that conversation with me. And that's disappointing and hurtful. So basically saying to everyone, y'all leaving me, out to dry here. I'm verbalizing that and then give people a chance to respond. I'm not saying the response is going to be constructive or useful, but that might be like a last ditch, like desperate move to try to get the conversation back to talking about what you want to talk about. And also for people to like recognize that they're leaving you out to dry, which sometimes people may not notice. But yeah, Dr. Opar, I'm sure you've been in situations where there's no save, Dr. Opar. People just don't show up and it's just you. And that can be really, really hard. And that might be a situation where you have to disengage because there's no one else present to enlist or someone declined your invitation. Because sometimes.
So I don't go into spaces thinking anybody will. I just don't have that. I don't expect it. It's always a surprise if it happens to me. Because I'm not very brave. I think brave, courageous people, eternally optimistic people have that expectation. And my prayer is that is always met. But I just don't, I haven't arrived. I'm not that spiritually mature to trust that people will come out from the woodwork and support me. So I'm always prepared to be alone. And it shouldn't be so. Absolutely. That's shame on everybody else for any of us to feel that way. But, once bitten, twice shy. So, and that is just not what I have experienced necessarily. I would hope so, but I've seen enough of people just walk by and when somebody has been hurt and where they should have stopped. I've also been aware of, good people that stopped and helped somebody in need, but I've seen enough of the opposite to sort of not risk it. And so I go into spaces, expecting. The other thing about courage, you mentioned courage and braveness too, is God bless you. I think anyone who would be brave enough, which by the way, the fact that you're confronting the issue already is evidence of your courage and braveness, whoever does do that. By the way, this is my husband's jacket. So if it is standing weirdly, it's because it's not mine. And it's and so and I'm shaped different from my husband. And aren't you glad about that? And so I just noticed there were things happening and I was just like, okay, all right, let's move and shift. So let's go back to where we were. I think we were saying that
Courage.
The courage, right, to what?
Just like, I think you were saying you don't really have based on experience and expectation that people will jump in, but you were saying something. Yeah, bravery and courage.
Yeah, that the courage to I'm sorry, I'm like totally losing my thoughts. So let me just kind of go back. So in terms of the courage to, I've never really blanked out this bad before, but let me come back to it. What'd you say?
I would say, I think you were going to say courage to confront something, but
if you are courageous enough to confront, thank you for I just needed two more words. And then I was this is the disadvantage of having a super hyperactive brain, because I have 1,200 thoughts right now, and I'm struggling to just keep one true thread. Don't worry about those other thoughts. You write it down later. If you have the courage to do that confrontation, then and be vulnerable. That's the word I was looking for. To be vulnerable, to confront, and therefore the vulnerability to sort of ask for help in that moment. I'm just really affirming the incredible courage that takes, the incredible courage that takes. And I don't know that I have enough courage. I fancy myself a courageous person to be that vulnerable, to, in the midst of me feeling least supported, least like, again, supported or with help and all of, and encouraged, and that I'm not alone, take the chance of asking, and at the risk that there will be dead silence. And you know how white folks love the silence. And so when they're not trying to be involved, you know, like the epitome of my name is Bennett and I ain't in it. And I just didn't want to just be part of, I just don't want to have to deal with that degree of like rejection at like my most vulnerable moment, with the hope that, okay, people will know. If people do, that's great, but if they don't, then I don't, that is, I think, an additional trauma on top of the trauma of what the gaslighting, and then on top of everything else like mixed together. Am I saying this is the right approach? Absolutely not. I'm just saying so right now in my lived experience, you know, I haven't like matured that spiritually to do that. But it is something like, you know, I could absolutely take notes and grow, you know, into. And I really pray, you know, Dr. Isom, to be honest, that we will have enough through the work you and I are doing, especially you, because you work more with white folks than I do, but that we breed enough bystanders that folks will not have to be the ones to elicit, you know, the support. I do recognize and appreciate the agency in being the one to do that, you know. And I'm trying to think of sort of, okay, what is the benefit of that outweighing any, like the pros outweighing any cons of doing that approach. So there's agency in deciding, using your voice to say and calling. That's another way of calling people out. Yo, I'm struggling here, and I you know, and none of y'all, you know, heifers are speaking up against me, and that's for shame on y'all. And there is agency, I think, in that. But should you be so beat down and shut down that you can't even do that, my hope is that there are bystanders that will stand up, you know, on your behalf. And Dr. Green is in the Ruth Green is in the audience, you know, on the YouTube audience. And there was an incident that occurred on Twitter Space where someone got into the space of predominantly Black and brown people and was pretty much racist. And the host was just like, basically froze, you know, in his own trauma response, trying to figure out what the heck to do in that moment while contending with his own emotions. And Dr. You know, Ruth Green demonstrated what it means to be a bystander and asked permission to address the situation while the host was recovering. And he gave her permission, she did her part, and then he recovered and he took over. It was really beautiful to witness, like, you know, it can be done. Dr. Ruth Green is an Indigenous woman, so there's that. But you know, it can be done. And I put more responsibility on folks to stand up, not just stand back. You know, that's my issue with the bystander term. You bystander, you standing back. No, I don't need you to stand by. I need you to get in the fight. You know, get up in here, you know, while I recover. And so yeah. Sorry for my blanking there. But speaking of, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say really, I mean, I want to acknowledge like how, you know, what informs my suggestions. I am a bit spoiled and biased, but both those things go together because of how, you know, the kinds of people I'm around. So they're still, you know, they're still white, but they have a skill set that's different than what other people are walking around with. Because I'm often in spaces with people who have a capacity, a skill set for verbalizing feelings and thoughts and distancing themselves from those feelings and putting distance between themselves and those feelings and thoughts. And I'm talking about mental health professionals. So, you know, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists. And I'll say there are some things you can do in certain spaces where some of the same behaviors are happening, but you can do an intervention that gets a different kind of result that would not necessarily happen in a different space. So I would say what I just offered around, you know, calling people out and bringing attention to your experience, that's a kind of intervention that everyone's not capable of responding to. And there might be people who do have that capability. And that's why I do appreciate, in very specific ways, being around people who are minded enough to be able to check themselves and, you know, have that awareness and investment in like, well, maybe I don't know exactly what's happening here. And this person has jarred me into a recognition of what's happening, you know, from their perspective, and I should pay attention. You do not have to be a therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever, to be able to do that. But I'm just saying I'm in lots of spaces around those people from those disciplines. And often that comes with a skill set that can make the interventions a bit more successful, not across the board. The last thing I'll say is that often people who have that training, they leave that training at the door when they enter into these conversations. So I'm not trying to, gloss up people from these disciplines, because I could tell some stories, right, about really regressive, childlike reactions to these conversations that are ridiculous. And it's like, how much training do you have? And like, where did it go? But in some very specific instances, that has been helpful with people who are sturdy enough to both feel and think at the same time, where they can correct themselves and kind of come back with the recognition of what happened. But you are right, Dr. Apar, that's not always available. And you do risk being transparent and vulnerable and risk further trauma from that. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
No, thank you. I appreciate that additional perspective. That is really, that's really important to the conversation. And I think the last thing I was going to mention is the mindfulness piece, which you mentioned, and how courage, again, reminder, is not the absence of fear, is doing what you need to do despite and in spite of feeling afraid. And the mindfulness piece is that, yes, I'm afraid and I'm sort of not all too comfortable, but that's not a fair expectation. Like, this is not a fun thing to do. Why would I be comfortable? Like, it's very human to not be comfortable, to anticipate that and sort of, let the feelings happen, but then let it go. So mindfulness is a wonderful tool to acknowledge like what's happening. But I think we need to be bold, like I said, sturdy, let me use your word, to anticipate and contend with the feeling, the discomfort and uncomfortable feeling that happens, understanding that, the fear that I feel in facing up to this situation is not like I'd rather feel this on discomfort or fear, whatever the name is, or sadness, or whatever the feeling is, than feel whatever feelings come up for me as a cost to not confronting this issue. And I think one of the things that may have said in this space before is that, one of the reasons and the ways I started standing up was that I could no longer tolerate, frankly, myself, but I could no longer tolerate the feeling I had, going to bed at night, knowing something happened to me and something unjust happened to me or someone close to me or around me, and that I didn't stand up. Like, that feeling sucks ass. And I don't want to ever feel that again. And I'd rather feel whatever the feeling is that one feels when they're in the midst of a fight like that for the right reasons. I'd rather deal with that than to feel that I went home and something happened to me, something happened to someone around me, near me, someone I know, and I could have stood up, I could have spoken for myself and or others, and I did not. So once that got intolerable, I started to face it and just deal with it and do it imperfectly. And the other thing, of course, that also keeps us is the fear of failing. Well, what if I try to deal with it and I don't have the words? I'm not as articulate. I'm not as, rah. It doesn't matter. Is it true? That's enough. That's enough. The truth is enough. However it comes out of your mouth, the authenticity of the moment, the truth, using these tools is enough. You don't have to be super eloquent. You don't have to have all the right words yet. It will come as you grow your literacy on this, but whatever you have is enough. And the truth is enough, in terms of expressing yourself, of course, with the addition of all these other tools we're talking about. So I just really felt moved to say that, thought that was important.
Yeah, my heart is like, oh my God, the truth is enough. That's a beautiful thing to offer, because we can convince ourselves otherwise, that the truth is not sufficient and that we need all these other things, and that's harmful to ourselves. So, Dr. Opar, we're out here in these streets, academic streets, community streets, community health streets.
All the streets.
I know, and we're
streets, every street.
We're tired. So we said we were going to do it, an hour. We went a little bit over an hour, but It was a very fruitful conversation, and I want to highlight what we're sharing here, which are just some of the resources that we mentioned. But I want to specifically point out the third one, which is a toolkit from the Community Healing Network in partnership with Emotional Emancipation Circles and also the Black Psychologist organization. And they've created something that can be really useful for that healing, process that we've talked about. So I encourage everyone to check that out. But with that said, I mean, we can say some final words and close out. And I mean, I will say, and I'll let you close, Dr. Opara. I will say, I appreciate you all joining who watched us. I appreciate the comments in the YouTube video. I'm sure there's some comments elsewhere. And we would love for you all, if you found it helpful, to share the video with others. It's available on YouTube. And then you could even use it to start your own conversations in whatever spaces that you're in. If you want the resources, they will all be linked in the YouTube video at the bottom. And the only one that's missing right now is the toolkit, which I'll go ahead and add. And with that said, I'll pass the mic to you, Dr. Opara. Any closing reflections?
Oh, no, thank you. This was a great conversation. And as always, it went by too fast. It's ridiculous how we get to talking. And I see how people have rooms and spaces and podcasts for 7 hours. I mean, we could talk about this ad nauseum. So thank you to everyone that is watching this live and on the replay. And yes, like Dr. Isom said, share this widely. Use it to open up your own space on Twitter Spaces or your own room on Clubhouse. Invite us to come into your space and room, and so that we can continue to build this. Ultimately, this is about building community and equipping our community to ultimately make a change, so that we can advocate for ourselves, but also for our families, our loved ones, and people that we have in our lives, that we are related and associated to. Teach others too. This information, knowledge is to be shared, is to be disseminated, and we build on it. Y'all may have more resources. You may have other people that let's build community on this. I host a space every Saturday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitter Spaces, the Anti-Racism in Medicine Action Roundtable, otherwise known as the Roundtable. Our hashtag is AIMART, AIMART. And then we have a skills building workshop that follows after the roundtable at 4 p.m. on Clubhouse. And it's a focused workshop. We take a tool or some approach, some framework, and we workshop it again with the idea to equip folk to be able to go ahead and advocate and move change for anti-racism in your respective institutions, organizations, or sphere of influence. This was real fun. Again, my mission in life is to dismantle white supremacy by eliminating anti-Black racism in medicine, healthcare, and public health. I'm so glad to all the folks engaging on the comment. You can reach me on Twitter, Instagram. You can email me. My handle is @INNODIM. I'll put it in the chat. And of course, Dr. Isom's. And I look forward to our next conversation. Let us know what topics you're interested in. What are the things, maybe you have more questions and other areas that we can explore more in depth. Go ahead and let us know. And like I said, open up your own spaces, invite us to talk. If you're part of organizations, have them invite us to also speak and consult and coach and compensate us at Cousin Led. And we can have that conversation as well. So with that, I'm happy to close out so I can go have some dinner. I haven't eaten since breakfast. I shouldn't tell you that. but I need to make that happen and hang out with the family because they are tearing up the house. That is absolutely what you heard. A house undergoing deconstruction.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and we'll see y'all next time. Take care. Bye.